John D. Rockefeller was the richest American ever to live, as well as being the founding member of the Three Comma Club as the world's first billionaire. At the height of his fortune, a few years before his death, he was worth an estimated $1 billion, which may not sound like much compared to today's billionaires. But this was back in a time when the USA's annual GDP was only $39.1 billion. This meant that his fortune was 3% of America's GDP. Adjusted for inflation to the year 2020, this would give old John D. here a fortune of $450 billion. That's more than Elon, Bill, and Jeff combined. But where is this fortune today? Of course, Rockefeller died almost a century ago, but if there was any fortune that was going to indefinitely set up future generations, surely it would be this one, right? The same goes for most of these historic magnates. The fortunes of everybody from Carnegie to the Medicis have more or less faded into total obscurity. Now, you might think you already know the answer, that these fortunes get split up amongst children and then children's children and then children's children's children until it was spread so thin amongst latter generations that it became almost totally irrelevant. But that's not entirely true. Furthermore, the real reason for the fall of these financial empires can tell us a lot about how money works as it has been passed down through generations in history. So to address the standard explanation for this phenomenon of missing fortunes, we need to address that yes, wealthy couples that have more than one child will normally split that money up evenly between them all. Of course, exceptions exist, but this is the standard operating procedure. John D. Rockefeller here actually had 5 children, which meant even his astronomical fortune was split up relatively quickly. This was before considering the charitable contributions that were written into the business titan's will. Obviously, that 1/5 share still made these children unbelievably wealthy, but adjusted for inflation, they wouldn't even top the Forbes list. In fact, they would only barely make the top 10. This process only got worse as time went on. Today, there are over 70 direct Rockefeller heirs, and this isn't even a particularly old dynasty. When we think of really old money like the Medicis and the Rothschilds, there are now thousands of direct heirs. But as we have said, this shouldn't actually matter. Sure, people make more people, but money makes money a lot faster. Let's take old man Rockefeller again. He was almost 100 when he died and passed this money down to children who were relatively elderly in their own right. In fact, tragically, by the time of his death, 2 of his children had already passed away, which actually changes this math quite a bit. As tragic as this was, it actually makes for a good example because on average, global billionaires today tend to have around 3 children on average. Now, when this fortune gets divided by 3 and handed down, it's not done so in the form of cash. It is almost entirely in the form of family trusts that will hold on to a broad selection of assets. With assets is that they tend to appreciate in value. Shares in the largest oil companies in the world and a broad portfolio of high-profile real estate would have done very well in the years following John D.'s death in 1937. Between that time and 1960, when John Rockefeller Jr. died 23 years later, the S&P 500 was up 1,000%, even after inflation. This would mean if John's children were just broadly invested in American markets, which they were, and lived on less than the modern equivalent of $1 billion a year, which they did, they would be many times wealthier when they died than when they received their inheritance. Even the prolific respawn rate of the Rockefeller family couldn't outpace pretty basic market returns. And this is ignoring the privileges these children would be given, like access to highly lucrative directorships, political appointments, and world-class educations that would enable them to bring in healthy incomes in their own right. To keep things simple, if we took the Rockefeller fortune of around $1 billion in 1937 and just kept it broadly invested until today, then we can follow market returns to show that this fortune would have ballooned to over $4.2 trillion, which would mean even spread out evenly amongst the 25 direct living beneficiaries today, they should each be the richest people in the world. This is also ignoring that they were primarily invested into oil, which up until recently has outperformed the general market as a whole. This should go doubly for older and, arguably, wealthier families like the Medicis and Rothschilds, who have had even more time for this wealth to compound on itself, but of course, it hasn't. So what gives then? Where did this money actually go? Well, 4 things. It got given away, it got taken from them, and it got too hard to keep tabs on, and it just didn't grow like you would expect it to. Rockefeller Sr. gave a good chunk of his fortune away during his lifetime, and an even larger chunk after his death. These donations went on to fund schools, museums, national parks, and an extensive list of other charitable ventures. This work was continued by his living children, who each in turn gave away close to half of their fortunes. This meant that money was not being reinvested and was instead only really maintaining its principal. Most of Rockefeller's grandchildren were worth about $3 billion, which is obviously still a huge amount of money, but goes to show the family's wealth was only ever managed to keep up with inflation, with the rest going primarily to charitable and political projects. While it looks like each of these grandchildren has a fortune 3 times larger than their grandfather, you must remember $3 billion today buys a lot less than $1 billion 100 years ago. The next issue is that it got taken from them. Everything from estate and capital gains taxes to divorce settlements have further cut down these funds. Beyond that, it has been really hard to keep tabs on this wealth. For obvious reasons, the family is not bragging about their fortunes to Forbes magazine like some other intergenerational tycoons. Since this wealth is now so diversified and split up amongst multiple family offices managing thousands of trusts, there really is no way to say who owns what unless they tell you, which they won't. Of people like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos don't speak openly about the details of their fortune, but it's pretty easy to work out since it is primarily tied up in a public company and a series of high-profile business ventures and properties. But for people like David Rockefeller or David Rothschild, there is no list of everything they own and owe, which is probably for the best. I'm sure you wouldn't want those kinds of details to be accessible about your own finances, and the same expectation of privacy should extend to these individuals as well, even though they are obviously many times wealthier. And finally, we have the reason I made this video in the first place. Investing has never been as lucrative as it was in the past 150 years. The Medicis rose to prominence in the 12th century. This was at the start of the Renaissance, which once again saw art and science flourish in Europe. But despite this, the economy of this region didn't really grow very much. Even by the most generous estimates, the wealth of Europe barely grew at all between the Middle Ages and the start of the Industrial Revolution. Most people were content to live a life the same as their parents before them and their children after. The idea of technical innovation and capital investments wasn't really a thing. Because of this, the logic that we have used for money, making more money by being invested into the market, does not hold true past about the mid-1800s. This means that humans making more humans did spread the family fortune without the chance for money making money to catch up. This may very well become the reality again. We have become very comfortable with the idea of constant compounding growth in an ultimately finite world, so there is the very real possibility that these past decades have been more of an anomaly rather than something we should take for granted. Either way, what if you were an aspiring financial monarch that wanted to establish a financial dynasty that lasted throughout the ages? Well, curiously enough, there are actually institutions that specialize in exactly this. For a pretty significant fee, Wealth management companies will structure family fortunes in such a way that they should remain intact almost indefinitely. These companies will write wills and suggest investment strategies for long-term sustained growth. They will also take a very hands-on approach to educating younger generations to make sure they are ready to properly steward the fortune when the time comes. They will also normally suggest a structure where the majority of the wealth gets passed to a single child over it, being split evenly and diluted. For good measure, why not make this your eldest son to really get a modern monarchy vibe going? Now, of course, this kind of structure has been made possible in recent decades, thanks to a robust financial system and a world fueled by innovation. But it's also become pretty unpopular. Things like the Giving Pledge have seen a good portion of the world's richest people agree to give a majority of their fortunes away to charity when they pass away. These two plans are obviously not compatible with one another, so it looks like once again giving money away may prevent us from all being slaves to the 17th generation of Bezos overlords. What a shame. Thank you for watching, and until next time.